I'd like to welcome all who have gathered this afternoon to participate in this public seminar. The public seminar is based on the PhD work of Mark Burke, but it is not a formal defense of the kind. Rather, the purpose is to play with the ideas emerging from this research, which is titled Rethinking Identity, Privacy and Citizenship in Public Service Digitalisation. So this is a really complex environment with governments across the world, including in South Africa, working to transition into a 21st century reality. And we are perhaps encountering some difficulties, some challenges that you cannot plan for in a technology-enabled transition, in this case, in a digital transition. And what Mark Burke is going to talk to us about this afternoon is precisely about some of those challenges, some of the ways of thinking about and interpreting the nature of public service digitalization. Mark will speak for about 20 to 25 minutes or so, give him a little bit of flexibility, and he has some interesting features of this presentation. And then we will invite Prof. Hosanna Tuna-Murinzi from the University of Johannesburg to make a few comments as a respondent. And then we'll open the floor for just views and interaction and engagement. And we have 3 or 4 questions that are of particular interest to Mark and to the nature of the subject. So that will be our order of business for today. So on behalf of the Link Centre, again, I welcome everyone. And I'm now going to hand over to Mark. The session is being recorded. The recording will be available. All the background work is being handled by Dr. Chris Armstrong. Once again, greetings, everyone. Mark, over to you.
Thank you very much, Lucy, and thank you very much to everyone that made time to join us this afternoon. I'm just checking, are you able to see the screen, Lucy?
Yes, we can. Everything looks in good order.
Thank you very much. So the way that I thought we may consider the subject of identity, privacy and citizenship in public service digitalization was going about it, focusing on 7 questions. The first one being, why do public services matter? And why do they matter specifically in South Africa or other countries facing challenges like South Africa? Then we're going to focus on what establishes the need, what is the rationale? Why now is it that we have to rethink identity, privacy and citizenship in this process of public service digitalization? We're going to stand still and just briefly consider the technological processes that underlie, that undergird, that underpin public service digitalization. And then we're going to try and draw out the implications for identity and privacy and citizenship in this process. We're also going to consider the extent to which a post-human approach, a post-human perspective is perhaps a more productive avenue for understanding the changing nature of identity, privacy and citizenship in this process. I'm going to very briefly take us through the cases in which this exploration will take place. And then I'm going to end with a question around identity, privacy, citizenship as a nexus, as opposed to individual dimensions, individual elements in this process of public service digitalization. Unfortunately, I have got to do a bit of magic. I have got to switch screens, unfortunately. Let me see how I'm going to do that. Because in the process of putting together the set of ideas, what we have done is to produce a little video clip that speaks to our understanding of why this is an issue and why it is important. So let me just see if I can get to it. Right. Let me know if you can all see and hear Lucy.
We can see, we cannot hear. Mark, so we're seeing the slide transitions, but we cannot hear anything.
Right, sorry, let me just try and figure out what that is. Just a moment. I need to share my computer sound as well. Let me just see if that's better. Just give me a moment. Include computer sound. I've got it.
Citizen X is a 64-year-old Xhosa woman, resident of Zituka, Mbashe Local Municipality, Eastern Cape. She is visiting the Idutwa Village Community Health Center to enroll in the Centralized Chronic Medicine Dispensing and Distribution Program, which makes accessing her diabetes medication more convenient, saving on transport costs and the time it takes to travel to the clinic from her nearby village of Zituka. The CCMD has been in operation since 2014 and is aimed at improving access to chronic medication by managing designated pickup points closer to communities. She also intends to register on the National Patient Registration System, an online registry of all patients using healthcare services in the country, which can be accessed at any healthcare facility. At the clinic, Citizen X approaches the receptionist with her smart ID card to register on the NPRS before enrolling to participate in the CCMDD program, and is told that the process won't take long to complete. However, the administrator soon informs Citizen X that her ID number appears to be a duplicate of a number that already exists on the Department of Home Affairs National Identification System, and that her ID number has been blocked. She must go to the police station to register a case of fraud in order for the Department of Home Affairs to investigate the matter and unblock her identity number, a process that takes between 6 to 8 weeks. Citizen X is now most concerned about access to her pension, due for collection in the following week, which will not be possible as a result of her ID number being blocked. The digitalization of a range of critical public services supporting the delivery of civic registration, health, and criminal justice services, central to individuals being able to exercise their rights and duties as citizens, is intended to improve access to services. It gives rise to the datification of the life events of citizens and their service encounters with the government, as these are recorded in digital form, giving rise to the emergence of the digital lives of citizens, stored in the networked digital systems and databases of government, without the recording and storing of encounters with public services, as data linked to the identity of a citizen and which comprises the digital lives of citizens. Individuals will not be able to access such services. The increasing digitalization of various aspects of the lives of citizens poses significant challenges, including the digitalization of identity management, the strength of the privacy protections afforded to safeguard the identity of citizens, and the effectiveness of the cybersecurity in place to protect the data of individuals. Identity, privacy, and citizenship remain preeminent institutions of the nation-state that structure the relationship between citizens and their government. The identity of an individual is essential for participation in contemporary society and the economy. The digitalization of public services is underpinned by three major enablers. That is automation, datafication, and mediation. Automation in public administration involves processes and techniques of standardization, formalization, and systematization of service delivery process. It is this capability that enables the datafication of the lives of citizens, as their interactions with government are transformed into computable data. This process of datafication facilitates more sophisticated ways of data analysis across ever larger datasets in the discovery of patterns and correlations. The relationship between citizen and government in public service interactions is mediated by an increasing range of digital network technology interfaces. The expansion and deepening of public service digitalization through automation, datafication, and mediation raises several concerns. The full implications of what a digital identity represents and the rights and duties vested therein is only now emerging as governments digitalize public services. It is critical to examine how identity, privacy, and citizenship in the implementation of large-scale public service digitalization projects are influencing and changing their very nature. Importantly, such an examination should consider how the processes of automation, datafication, and mediation shape the underlying power relations in citizen-government interactions.
Thank you for your indulgence. Let me just switch screens again.
Thank you, Mark.
So what that clip was trying to demonstrate is that although we're talking about the interaction of that specific citizen related to different government services, the coming together, the linking of the interoperability of these systems have very, very real effects when things don't work. In this particular instance, it was her pension payout linked to her identity registration, where there's the potential for a duplication. And of course, we understand that public services matter because they're a gateway and engine to a country's pathway to development, because amongst other things, it has the potential for increasing disposable household income, reducing inequality, rural-urban income disparities, and poverty. And so in a country like South Africa, where we know there is significant problems related to poverty, inequality, and unemployment, public services matter for their distributional potential, the distributional consequences. And in terms of our development plan, it is recognized that poor households bear the cost of poor public service provision. It's really important that in the digitalization of public services, that we don't reinforce these existing disparities, but rather use it to close the gap between rich and poor, between urban and rural, and Black and white South Africans. So the big question then, why now? Why is there a need to rethink identity, privacy, and citizenship? And there are two main drivers, at least the argument and the premise on which this area of work is based. The one is that the material foundations around space and time is beginning to change in a digital environment compared to an analog environment. In an analog environment, we are very much bound by physical space. It's our immediate physical presence that matters in particular circumstances, whereas in the digital environment, we have the potential to transcend territorial and spatial boundaries, and it gives rise to virtual space as a different kind of space with different kinds of potentialities. When it comes to time, in the analog environment, we've always been focused with working with linear time comprising sequential units of time, whereas in the digital environment, we are talking about a blurring the sequencing of activities. It enables time-sharing practices as we are doing now, sitting in different places, perhaps in different time zones, but being able to share in the seminar. And in that way, blurring or disordering the sequence of social practices, and at the same time enabling simultaneity and asynchronous interactions. Pierre Levi, a French philosopher, spoke to the fact that this plurality of time and space is beginning to blur, do away with the boundaries between public and private, personal and shared, subjective and objective. And so the changing of these material conditions, in fact, is one of the key drivers that brings us to the point of having to reconsider identity, privacy, and citizenship in the digital environment. At the same time, digitalization also challenges the fundamental ideas that have informed the development of personhood in society. Again, when we think about individuality in an analog environment, the independent individual, the ideal individual, the exceptional individual that has free will, whereas in the digital environment, our individuality is constructed through our relations. We are embodied beings in the world and always becoming. From a subjectivity point of view, there's this universalist idea of subjectivity that is essential and static. And in the digital environment, we are talking about emergent and complex processual, constituted through the relationships or the relations that we have, always a process of becoming. From an agency perspective, at the analog environment, the individual or the person is autonomous, self-deterministic, whereas in the digital environment, we are talking about shared agency between humans and technologies arising from their mutual entanglements. So the way that we think about the individual, the person in contemporary society, and the material foundations are really driving this quest to rethink identity, privacy, citizenship, and so on. So let's just pause for a bit and consider these major processes underlying public service digitalization. On the one hand, we firstly have automation, which is really about the digital equipment and control systems that incorporate techniques of standardization, formalization, and systematization for the inscription of business rules and algorithms in machine executable form. This is not to say that in the analog world, processes of standardization and formalization was not important, but digital technologies amplify this process. The same with datafication, being able to convert information into machine-readable, quantifiable data through processes of aggregation, registration, classification, segmentation, profiling, and prediction. So all of these techniques are being introduced, are being amplified in the process of public service digitalization, and then, of course, mediation, which is really about the interfaces, the technologies that mediate the potential for action that we have, consisting of configuring, making things legible, and interfacing. So those are the underlying components with the associated techniques that public service digitalization is a very large term. But if you begin to strip it down to its core elements and to its core techniques, these are really the processes that underpin it. At the same time, we've got these elements related to the nature of the relationship between government and citizens. And we know that identity, as the clip has shown, the digital representation of the citizen is foundational, it is essential, it is critical as the first step in the public service interaction. Privacy, on the other hand, is about the individuals being free from interference, of which informational privacy in the context of digitalization is as significant and relating to the ability of individuals to control what information is made available on them. Now, this becomes critical in the context of sharing citizen data where systems interoperate in government. Citizenship is the official recognition, the rights and duties associated with a citizen, and the extent to which these are becoming more digitally mediated, especially insofar as the interfaces, the interactions between public services and, well, governments and citizens are concerned. So the big question then is, in a sense, to put it colloquially, what happens when the tire meets the tar, the rubber meets the tar? What happens when these underlying processes of automation, mediation, datification impact, shape, influence the construction of identity, the extent to which privacy has a role to play in protecting that identity, and the kind of consequences these have for citizenship? And so the analytical framework being structured for this work is really rests on the ontological coordinates, a way of understanding the world from a post-humanism, a human computational assemblages perspective. And what this really entails from a post-human perspective is the decentering of the human as the most significant, the most important agent in the flow of activity, because what it does, it enables us to look broader than just the human, to understand the human in the context of a set of human computational assemblages that comprise computational ecosystems. And so once you open that door of seeing humans not as the only ones or as the only entities responsible for action, responsible or having agency, it brings in the analytical tools of actor network theory that recognizes very much that things can act as well. In fact, to the extent that in ANT, that's actor network theory, there's a reference to actants as opposed to individual actors, because it recognizes the extent to which things other than human beings shape, influence, and can have. The example always being used is a hammer. A hammer it's something that you use to hit a nail on the head, but it can also be used as a door stopper. Actants and actors come together in a network, in relation. The sets of relations, the sets of association that comprise these relationships constitute actor networks. And it's in the interaction between these, in the networks, that agency arises, and affordances, in other words, that which you are able to do as a result of the networks that are constituted in these processes. So those are the two key theoretical frameworks being drawn on. It's the post-human perspective that regards humans and the world as a unity, as opposed to the dichotomy of subject and object. It places all entities, humans and non-human objects, on the same ontological footing, and it gives rise to an understanding of humans in computational assemblages that form complex ecologies. And in that sense, it gives rise to hybrid entities in which agency is partial and distributed. As I've noted, the actor network theory will be the methodological approach. There's a few key tools that are quite important. The human and non-human entities co-constructing networks of association, the process of translation, it's a specific technical term used that gives stability to these actor networks, that then gives rise to the kind of agency that's regarded as a distributed achievement. So those are the ontological coordinates and the epistemological orientation adopted for this work. I now want to just very quickly segue into what is happening in public service digitalization in South Africa. And if you trace the historical evolution, it has a long history, a 70-year history of the introduction of digital systems, technology systems in government. The 90s was really characterized by system-wide transversal management support systems being introduced, particularly through Treasury. Followed by the first decade of the 21st century, where it was large-scale systems in particular domains. If one thinks about e-Natis for transport, that's a classic example of that. And in post-2020, we begin to see the introduction, the emergence of more sophisticated platforms and management systems with greater potential for interfacing, for interoperability. We are particularly going to investigate civic registration systems, which is really about home affairs. And the specific system that we would like to assess in this instance is Harness, and the upgrading of Harness, the automated biometric identification system that is intended to grow into our most significant, most important national identification system, which, if you consider the 2020 policy statement that was published by the Department of Home Affairs, they regard that as the central system, both for the private sector and for the public sector to validate identity. In the case of the public health system, we're talking about healthy citizenship here. We'd like to explore the health patient registration system. Again, if you look at all the systems around it, you'll note that it is very much an ecosystem, and one cannot look at it in isolation from, for example, the district health information system, the central chronic medicine dispensing and distribution system, and so on. Of course, one would have to understand how that interfaces with the electronic vaccination data system, which is a more recent phenomenon. The one thing to note about the digitalization in health is that it has been given a significant boost by a few factors. The one being that there's been strong leadership. There's a burning platform in the form of the National Health Insurance, which would be unable to do the kind of cross-subsidization envisaged without having the data available to make those kinds of decisions. And then there's the integrated justice system, and we're talking here about 6 departments, overall 8 governmental entities, so there are lots of systems, but where they all tie in is the integrated justice transversal hub, and that's the area we'd like to explore in this conversation. Where does it leave us? The further and the deeper I went into this exploration, there was a recognition that looking at identity, privacy, and citizenship separately is not going to be very helpful in this context of digitalization, and perhaps there is an opportunity to understand the nexus, how privacy provides a protective layer around identity, and how identity and privacy then enables the constitution of a particular kind of citizenship. So in that sense, recognizing the intertwined and entangled nature of identity, privacy, and citizenship, and through looking at it from that nexus perspective, one is able to appreciate better the implications for public service digitalization, for citizen-government relations. And ultimately, it is not necessarily identity or privacy or citizenship that one is interested in, but it's the power relations that emerge from how it is being constituted in this digital environment, and then also what this suggests, what this implies for the mode of digital government emerging in South Africa. Where it leaves, well, me in particular in this instance, is this idea of a 3x3 in terms of understanding digitally enabled citizenship, where you have on the one side these 3 big elements, factors around automation, datification, mediation, and on the other hand, these big questions that enable citizenship through the lens of identity, privacy, and citizenship. I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Very good. Thank you very much, Mark, for an extensive presentation in a really short time. We will now switch directly to Prof. Zanat to his response.
All right, thank you very much. Very fascinating talk. Do you hear me, first of all?
Yes,
we hear you, Hosanna.
Oh, fantastic.
We can hear your equipment, but you're louder, so it's fantastic. Thank you.
All right, yeah, so please bear with me. It's ESCOM or something. All right, I find this quite a refreshing conversation, I must say. because I think there is such a huge push towards digitization and everything technology that we tend to forget the non-technology side of issues and the things that affect us as human beings. So just to summarize what I heard you saying, Mark, and thanks Dr. Lucy for inviting me to be a discussant, and thanks Mark, I think this is very interesting. It was easy for me to say yes to be a discussant because I think this is the heart of what thesis really should look like, to engage deeply in the real issues. So just to recap how I understood it is effectively public service digitization is having an effect on our identity, our privacy, and also our citizenship, and the relationship between citizens and government. And essentially, you bring up the issue of power relationships. So for me, this is also fascinating because you are merging identity, privacy, and citizenship, and each of them is huge in its own self. So merging them and having your 3x3 matrix is going to be quite interesting. And I see each of them also touching on things like responsible and ethical use of AI, an area which I've been involved in recently, both in Rwanda and in Africa, and how AI is pushing a lot of suggestion, if I can put it that way, but I'll discuss that a bit later. So it also ties in with what I saw recently, a UN report on the rise of human insecurity as a major threat in the Anthropocene. So the Anthropocene is seen as the age where humans began to tinker in the environment in order to make life better for them, but also began to affect the environment. So this human insecurity suggests that there's an increasing sense of being watched, of not being safe. It kind of relates to the privacy issue as well. So when you begin to talk about privacy, identity, and citizenship, it kind of ties in with that sense of, are we more than just a single data point? And we also do know that our interests are increasingly being engineered using AI algorithms. You have a conversation today, and your phone immediately begins to tell you, or offering you suggestions on what to look at. So we are aware that even the suggestions we are getting are being driven by external entities. And you are increasingly also finding individuals who identify more with Facebook and Instagram than they do with their government. So for example, they will probably listen to Ronaldo more than the president of the country on things like vaccination. So there's that kind of changing dynamic of citizenship as well. Of course, it's not it's not out there completely that people will listen to Ronaldo more than the president, but there's a growing, can I say, the influencers, as they call them. So one of the other things that I think I like with your thesis is that it's engaging with the intentional and unintentional consequences of digitization of the public service. Yes, we want it. Yes, we push for it. Lucy and I have been interested in rolling out digital skills across South Africa and all that. So we see there's a need for it. So as the government digitizes, do we have the skills for that? And there's an implicit assumption that we need to digitize government as quickly and as fast as is possible. And you've got good examples there. Okay. So the question is, one of the questions that comes to my mind is, what happens when government begins to engage in the same way that these technology giants and social media platforms are engaging with us, in the sense that they are changing our sense of privacy? They are suggesting to us who we should be, how we should behave. That's really critically is our identity. And so when will government begin to engage in the same way? So for me, those are interesting questions, and I'll talk about them in the perspective of power relationships. And some of the considerations I would like you to consider as well, and I think which are worth considering. Then in terms of a philosophical approach, I see that you take a very strong interpretive approach, both for your epistemology and your ontology. because interpretivism assumes things are stable, yet not stable. It looks at the lived experiences and understands those relationships. Yet you also talk about power relationships. So I find that there's a kind of there are two levels apart from each other, because once you talk about power, power changes everything, because we do know that power, but that the way power manifests is not directly, it manifests at a very high structural level. And I'm talking about from a critical realism point of view. And so power brings in a critical kind of theory and critical realism perspective to say what we see is not what really exists. Or what we see is what is being driven by agents which are at a superstructure level, who are determining the things that are that we actually experience, and they also determine the mechanisms through which we experience reality. And I'll give you an example. For example, we do know, or we assume that there are a lot of, there's been a male dominance, a patriarchal kind of male dominance throughout society. And because of that male dominance, most systems are structured in such a way that they support male dominance. And what we exist and what we enjoy and consume is driven by that kind of super social structure. So when power relationship, when you talk about power relationships, those power relationships now need to begin being questioned. And so it brings in the unseen hand that is actually stirring society. And if we're talking about datafication, that really speaks a lot to AI. Will government begin to behave in the same way? To what extent do we as humans have agency in that kind of in that relationship we have with government, or shall we be like brains in a vat? So those are interesting questions, because one of the arguments that Foucault, who deals a lot in power, he mentions that power doesn't lie in a central institution. It actually lies within practices of collectives, whereby a number of people decide this is what we want, and they engineer systems to look at that. So I would really like you to engage in that power dynamic, because you're engaging with identity, privacy, and citizenship from an interpretive perspective. Yet you talk about power relationships, and power relationships are very dynamic, as you understand. Then the other part I would also like you to consider, and will bring a lot of depth, is the issue of axiology. You see, when you discuss philosophy, there's the epistemology, there is the ontology, and then there's a third one which sometimes we tend to ignore. But because you're talking about privacy and identity, it's the issue of values, axiology. Now, axiology touches on values, what we believe is right and wrong. South Africa is one of the most diverse countries, yet is also diverse economically, because we've got the rich, super rich, and the super poor, and it's such a huge gap in between the two. So what would the role of values play in this datafication? Will the system be designed and steered towards pro-poor, anti-rich? Do they have a voice? What value systems are we beginning to engage with in the multiplicity of value systems that we have in South Africa, particularly because we've got a very diverse society, ethnically, culturally, and in all the ways that you can imagine. So for me, the issues of power relationships and axiology, value systems, those would be very interesting to engage in. But overall, I think the thesis is very interesting, and I'd be very interested to see the results that come out of this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Hosanna, for digging deeper into these questions and trying to surface the challenges that lie within the particular segments that Mark has chosen to study. So we're now going to open the floor. We'll have a completely open floor As I said, we do have a few questions in hand, but before we proceed to ask and examine the questions that we have designed, let's have a show of hands. We can possibly take one or even two rounds, three questions each, questions, comments, contributions. So let's take a first round of three. I see Jonathan. I'll look for two more hands. I see another hand, Craig Wing, and one more, please. One more. Shall we just start with those two? Let's start with those two. Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Okay, great. I think you can hear me. So I'll be brief, but basically, Mark, I really like that, and I think that works well. And yeah, really looking forward to kind of where you go with it and where you take it. There's a draft chapter that I'd like to share with you and talk with you about, but let's do that offline. I've got a comment and a question. The comment is, it seemed to me that the three-part on the society side was kind of more distinct than the three-parter on the other side. That's a comment. I think there's, effectively, I think what I'm saying is that there's more conceptual overlaps between identity, privacy, and citizenship. The question is, and it follows a little bit, or at least it touches on some of the things that Hosanna was talking about. You used the term automation, and when I think about those three processes on that side, and I think you've nailed them, but the term that's used is more, or at least like in some of the work that Feroz Kachalia and I and others are doing at Mandela Institute, we think about it more as artificial intelligence rather than automation. So my question is, you've used the term automation. I think there may be a slight difference between that and a kind of rise of artificial intelligence. So that's the question, if you can speak to that difference. Thank you. Looks great.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Let's hear from Craig Wing. Craig, go ahead.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that, Mark. Great to chat to you again. I found that enthralling, and I had to ask a question or two and make a comment just to demonstrate your brilliance for the floor. So I've really got two points rather. The first is just an anecdote and an example that may reinforce that you may look into. And then the second is just a comment or a question. So the first anecdote is, as you know, and the rest of the floor may not know, I work a lot with corporates, really within the area of commercials and understanding the impact of technology. And an interesting anecdote that you alluded to was the decoupling from the human being to the actual digital identity. Paradoxically, at this big bank that I did a consulting project for a number of years ago, they had the opposite problem. And it was quite funny because essentially what they had is they had robots, physical robots that were doing work, but they weren't able to grant access and or workflow processes to these robots without assigning them an employee number. So the decoupling of the physical or the actual human, or in this case, entity, and the digital identity, I think is one that is very, very interesting to me. Further, when you have a look at a book that was written by Eric Schmidt and Jared Cohen, who was then head of policy for Google in 2013, they make a very similar kind of observation. We're now looking at 9 years later, almost a decade later. And their observation is when you start to have a look at the proliferation of the digital world and online identities, we can start to create these very strange situations where my online identity is not only decoupled from the reality of who I am as a human being, but they can create a false history and therefore projection into the future. So, for example, you could be a 53-year-old Caucasian man that's a banker, but online you can create an identity of a 23-year-old African refugee, for argument's sake. And therefore you have the rights of different things and access to different processes and products, etc. And so the question that I have is twofold. The first is, how do you then validate the actual and the virtual? What is the redundancy systems back behind that? And secondly, a bit of an easier one that relates to that first question is the role of emergent technologies such as blockchain and decentralization of these identities in the public domain. Thank you very much.
Thank you to you, Craig. Mark, let me just put it right in your hands. Go ahead.
Thank you, Lucy, and thank you to everyone who posed those questions. I want to start with Hosanna. Hosanna, you've touched a nerve in terms of the interpretivist approach and then the questions of power. It's something that I haven't quite resolved for myself because I'm a realist and I'm drawing on these interpretivist approaches methodologically. But there is, fortunately, I'm following quite closely a strand of post-human thought, a school of post-human thought that reconcile this idea of being reality being constructed by your experience, but there's also an understanding that there are structures inherent in our existence that, in a sense, shape the opportunity space within which you experience reality. So it is a question in my mind that I haven't, and I know you can't go into the field necessarily with some of these issues not quite settled in your mind, but it is something that leaves me with a bit of tension in terms of my personal view of the world, which is a realist view of the world. If a tree falls in the forest, the tree has fallen whether you heard it or not, versus your experience shaping. For me, there's a little contradiction that I haven't quite worked out for myself as yet, and I suppose that's the usefulness of being in a situation like this, constantly working at finding perhaps an avenue where these two ideas, these very primary ideas in the way that we understand the world in the ontological framing can coexist. Jonathan, the use of the word automation was very conservative. It is really looking at the fundamental process that provides the basis for artificial intelligence to emerge over time. So in my mind, I make the distinction between artificial intelligence, which I'm going to use the word crudely, is where you have sufficient data through the automation process to be able to get for machine learning to start taking place. So for me, there's a little bit of a precondition, and that's why I'm using the word automation. The cases that I've looked at, the work that I've done in the public sector suggests that there are tinkerings, there are little murmurs of machine learning beginning to happen. For instance, in SARS, where there's a big shift around data analytics. And in a sense, I'm beginning to address your question as well, Craig, by virtue of this example where in SARS, there's a shift from the kind of gatekeeper role that SARS used to play in customs management, customs control, towards a more, and in fact, this is happening for personal income tax as well, where the data is beginning to shift towards a risk, where the approach is a risk-based approach, made possible by access to data that they now can use to identify where the risks are. And this, in a sense, also relates to this idea of power not as discipline, but power as modulation, where events are anticipated. But that's a separate conversation we can get to. The question of emergent technologies, Craig, that's what I'm linking towards. There are pockets of emergent technologies beginning to surface in the public sector. And so it's not that widespread as yet. There's lots of thinking around the use of blockchain, for instance. So this is an ongoing area of work that's really beginning to open up now. Jonathan, I hope I addressed the question of AI versus automation. As I said, I'm being conservative here. I'm looking at the very foundations being established for automation to arise. Lucy, I think I can stop there.
Yes, thank you, Mark. I'd now like to invite participants to raise any question. It is in the nature of the seminar that you're welcome to comment on anything. So Channel, Jean, Dipanvita, Ewan, Pfizer, Kitumetsi, Kiru, Mariam, Nadia, Ndumiso, Nozipo, Simon, Tulani, anything from your side? Mariam, go ahead.
Thank you, Lucy. Thank you, Mark, for the presentation. I'm not going deep into any kind of research area, but some comments from my side. The first thing from your practical side, you have to look at is the National Population Register, because that's the base of any identity of any citizen in South Africa. And that's one system which is actually now Department of Home Affairs is actually looking into it and seeing that, how this population registry is linked to other systems, so not only in the Home Affairs, but with the other, like you mentioned about Department of Justice, Department of Basic Education, Department of Health, because everybody needs this population register linkage, which is not currently happening in the level which we need to do it because of interoperability issues between systems. So when you come into, like you saying that this whole thing is about identity and citizenship and coming with the privacy, I think that's one area you have to look at in practical way. Also, you spoke about some examples of health information systems, but my understanding is that even though different provinces have different systems, there is nothing working because if a patient is registered in Mpumalanga, and if that patient moved to Eastern Cape, I think they are battling to see the information of the patient because the systems are not integrated. So that's another level of issues which when we come to like a automation or, something like that. Then another example you can look at is because I didn't see you mentioning about Department of Basic Education, some of the information systems they created, even though it's a very crude system, but SSAM is a very simple example of how they're trying to put administration work of schools together, coming into the national department, and how they're managing the information of like school kids' marks, things like that. So that's another one. I think on your timeline, I didn't see anything mentioning about the basic education and the work they are doing there. So basically, and also, there's some questions now we are looking at how emerging technologies coming in, playing in government now. So we from the department, CETA is actually looking into exploring a lot of work onto big data and AI. Just to say, same as what you are saying, that like how the data which we are creating can be used for a creation of applications. So CETA is actually having some or have some big fund now to spend on big data and AI kind of work to be done in the government. So these are just some comments from my side. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Mariam. Appreciate it. Kiru, you're next. Go ahead.
Hi, thanks, Lucy. Hi, Mark. Hi, everybody. So I've just got 5 minutes before I need to go into another meeting. So really, just quickly, just 3 points, right? So this emerging concept of the metaverse, I think, Mark, is whilst it's often seen as a lot of hype, there's a lot of issues of identity in a metaverse that needs to be considered. And in the banking sector, for example, the metaverse has the possibility, because it's going to embed digital technologies and digital and blockchain and those kinds of emerging technologies. Central banks are starting to look at decentralized finance as opposed to normal fiat currencies, and that's going to affect identity. And you talk about self-sovereign identity in that kind of concept. That's just one thing. The second thing around issues of privacy, there's emerging citizen rights, like the right to be forgotten and things like that, which again, there's a power dynamic between, the right to be forgotten, because it gives inordinate amount, while it's a great thing in terms of citizens' privacy, it gives an inordinate amount of power to those tech platforms that then have the ability to remove your identity, right? It's akin to whitewashing history by removing pictures, a person's picture from an old photograph, rewriting history in that way. And the third thing, I think, in terms of power relationships, the system in China, around identity is probably a good example of something that we may need to just delve deeper to see how those power relations are starting to emerge in terms, with the use of identity. Yeah, so just really quickly, those 3 points.
Thank you, Kiru. It's always helpful to have bring the bigger picture into the seminar discussion. So thank you so much for that. And also just remembering that this is not just a seminar where we do Q&A with Mark, but we're really marshalling our own thoughts about the issues at play. Let's see if there are maybe 1 or 2 more hands. If not, we will delve into the questions. And these are questions not for Mark, really, but for our conversation. So I don't see any further hands. Let me raise the first question. Perhaps the audience could comment. And I think you have commented to some extent on this notion of the 3x3 perspective. On the one hand, we need a perspective of the digitalization process, and Mark has suggested 3 dimensions to the digitalization process: automation, datafication, and mediation. And then on the other hand, we see how citizens are... It's 16 hours. How citizens are already being reconstituted in the digitalization process. So we've spoken about that as well. But what is your reaction from the audience to the convergence of these in a 3x3 reality? Let's take a few comments on that. 1 or 2 comments on that. We can see that on the screen. And of course, it's not noted. Thank you, Jonathan. And of course, we know that it's not simply a set of items and a set of another items, that there are many ways in which these dimensions interact. Any comments on that point? I might call on a few people again. Ewan, Simon, Nozipo. Simon, go ahead.
Sure. Thanks, Lucy. Thanks, Mark. It's going to be a fascinating topic, and I'm really looking forward to the insights from the research. Yeah, my thoughts are really maybe taking it wider than what Mark's identified for the research. That was why I was a little hesitant to raise the question earlier. But in terms of the wider debate, I do think there's a really big challenge in terms of thinking about the interaction of what are public services with the realm of the private platforms. So I think in many areas that the private platforms are making the running and pushing an efficiency argument, which then is being translated into the development of public services, and thinking about how the different interests play out across this framework, and then how to grapple with the different levels of power dynamics. And Mark alluded to it briefly in passing in one of the answers, and also talked about it earlier, and it was raised by the discussant as well. So it's obviously running through a lot of this, but really reflecting on how different conceptions of power will be utilized here, and and what the research will also say about those different conceptions of power, and this interplay of interests between the public and the private realm, and different interests cutting through both.
Thank you, Simon. Yes, I think that drawing our attention to the fact that we're living in a platform world, and that platform dynamics and the nature or the emerging nature of the platform economy is going to influence, or does influence, this conversation is certainly something we need to talk more about. And you're quite right, we are now in that part of the seminar where we're no longer really just restricted to Mark's guiding thoughts, but where we can have an open discussion on the nature and challenges of public service digitalization. Any further thoughts on this point about the 3x3 perspective, or shall I raise another question? Just looking at the time, I'm happy to do so. The next question for discussion is the notion of being or becoming post-human. Is the idea of the post-human relevant to investigate in the South African context? And if it is, why? Any thoughts from the audience? What do you make of the notion of not just yourself being thought of as post-human, but an entire population being thought of as post-human? Hosanna, go ahead.
Thanks. A very valid question. I think the answer is definitely yes. We've got to think of ourselves post-human, mainly because whether we like it or not, we are so embedded into technology, and we communicate with technology. COVID showed us that technology is a strong part of our lives. Therefore, we have to engage with it. There's almost no option. But the question now for me is, how do we begin to regulate the extent to which it engages with us? Therefore, in creating tools like AI, blockchains, and all that, we've got to have a greater voice in the way these technologies are shaped, because the way they are shaped also implicitly shapes us. So actor network theory for me was interesting because it gives us a duality and kind of balances out humans and non-humans. So that was interesting. But the answer for me is a clear yes.
Thanks, Hosanna. So let me, I'll come back to you in a moment, Craig, but let me ask someone who is making us post-human to comment. Tulani, you're an apps developer, and you're also very keen to build platforms. You're engaged in building platforms. What's your sense of the fact that software development, programming, and developers like yourself are turning us into post-humans? What thoughts, what challenges, what concerns do you find in this activity?
Thanks, Lucy. My mind is racing and pacing on this subject alone. I think we'll need more than a day to discuss this.
Yes.
As we speak, we're busy building a platform. We're actually far ahead. And part of the requirements. So as we onboard you on the platform, we'll actually check your identity, meaning your ID. So your ID is everything for you to proceed on the platform. Without your ID, you either then provide a passport, which also has to be valid. So there's a lot of identity validation that we're doing. Just to give a picture, when you go to a bank today, you either put in a thumb and a scan happens and a picture, if not your identity has not been compromised, ideally your picture comes up and the person, the agent who's helping you can see that you are who you say you are. So we've actually taken that route as well, where you furnish your ID number and we bring back your picture, and obviously we confirm your status if you are alive or deceased. So this topic is such a, I don't know how to put it. My mind is racing and pacing. And the issue of post-human as is such a big issue. At one client right now that we're busy onboarding, we're sitting with 570,000 odd archived receipts that cannot be allocated to people who've been paying. And just last week, the finance manager was asking, so what should he do with this, with these receipts? So there is a need, I think, to Hosanna's, just to echo what Hosanna is saying, absolutely there is, it is a big factor. The post-human element cannot be ignored. I probably need a day just on this topic. And I think me being involved on building this other platform, I'm thinking to even change my topic to the other platform, but I think that's a story for another day between you and I. So it is very interesting. It's definitely a subject to consider, and it cannot be ignored. I think that's my long and short of it. It cannot be ignored.
Yes. Thank you so much, Tulani, for kind of taking us, in a sense, backstage, behind the scenes of the production of the post-human, and in a sense, telling us that there is no other future. This future is already with us. Yes, it's constantly being constituted and reconstituted, but the pieces of constituting the post-human are already there, and they are not just an ID number. They are not just a thumbprint or a fingerprint. They could even constitute a receipt or electronic transaction that identifies you. Very, very interesting way of thinking about the notion of post-human. So we have two more questions. The next question is a little bit more methodological. Not just methodological in terms of Mark's way of seeing the research design, but also in terms of thinking about how South Africa creates a digitally enabled public service. And the question is this, and perhaps Nozipho, you could make a few comments. Kiru, if you're still with us, make a few comments. Mariam as well. Craig, I know I did see your hand, but if you don't mind me just putting this next question on the table. So here's the question. Are we, South Africa, using an analog approach to creating a digitally enabled public service? Are we using an analog approach? Are we trying to build a digital public service, but behaving in an analog way? I wonder what your thoughts might be about that. And I'm specifically interested in what Nozipho, Kiru, and Mariam might think about that. So let me just give them a moment, Craig, and then we'll come to you. Mariam, any thoughts from your side?
Yes, Lucy. I think, like I said, I think there is a new policy also for e-identity came in December last year, or even November last year, looking at how to move our identity into the e-identity form. So there's a policy came from Department of Home Affairs looking at how to change our identification. So like I said, the National Population Register is the base now, which there is a lot of cleaning work they need to do before they actually move all the information on that system to other systems and linkage to that. A simple example I want to use me myself. I'm not a born citizen of this country. I came here and then I went through a process of, like getting my citizenship. So all of you, those who are born citizen of this country can actually get ID document on that smart ID, and I'm not qualified to do that. Or even when I want to apply for my passport, I have to go and stand in the queue at the Home Affairs because I can't apply through any of these bank branches or anything like that. What's the reason? Because my information is not on the National Population Register, and my information is sitting in some other register, and they are having a lot of issues of merging these two. So the question you're asking is about, are we looking at analog systems and then moving into it? Not really, because that's the idea of, like everything what you do now, you have to have your digital identity. They are trying to capture you in that space and then get the database cleaned up and ready to use and linkage with other systems which actually go back and look into that. A simple example again, yesterday my Standard Bank asked me to verify myself. So they asked me to scan my ID and my face recognition. And then they went and checked my face and my thumb impression with the Department of Home Affairs. Within seconds, they came back and said, you are the right person. Now you are digitally identified on the bank app. So there is linkages which is happening. So the question you asked, if I understand correctly, we are trying to make the identification in the digital space correctly instead of using some analog systems to go and do the job. So that's my answer to that question, if I understood the question correctly.
Yes, yes. No, that's an incredibly useful response, Mariam, because you've said that now testing identity will test multiple points of reference, not one point of reference. And the multiple points of reference include points that are not simply an ID number, which is very analog, right? So I think you successfully demonstrated that there is a process of transition to thinking digitally about digital identity or identity in the digital world. Craig, please go ahead.
My question was actually already answered, Lucy, but I do have a question around this one, around the use of data, etc. And perhaps Mark can comment. I'd love to get his thoughts around the interplay between public and private and the use of data. Let's, for example, for a second, let's negate, and I don't want to say forget, but let's for a second not worry about things like GDPR and rights and all that kind of stuff. But the integration between public data and private data, and how do we enrich a greater data set for exactly this purpose? So I'd love to get some comments there from Mark around that question.
Okay, all right. We'll just hold that question for a moment. Nozipho, I saw your hand. Please go ahead.
Yes, Lucy, thank you so much. And I've been really following the discussion, which is quite a very interesting one for me, but I think also a well-timed kind of a research, at the times that we are in, particularly as a country. And I will not be able, I'm not necessarily saying, yes, we are probably moving digitally or taking a digital approach, but I believe that the regulatory environment is still very analog in the way we approach, regulation or policy development or policing, if I may use that term at the present moment. So to answer your question, whilst there is an acknowledgement, in terms of the digital approach, but I cannot help myself but say, indeed, we are still, especially within the public service, we still really very much analog in terms of the approaches that we take. And you see this also, how, like the previous speaker, I think it's Craig, who was talking about the integration of what is happening, for within the bigger space of data management. That on its own is a very clear example of lack of, the integration, which could be easily done if we had a much more digitally a focused approach in the way things are done. Thank you so much. That would just be my small comment. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Nozipo, because what that says then is that there are some parts or some transitional spaces that are more digitally inclined. The nature of the thinking that informs digitalization is itself digital, and in some other cases, still analog. So, Mark, we're going to come back to you to respond to Craig, and of course to engage with any of the other points made by the audience.
So the question of the flow of data across public-private boundaries, it's a big question, but not one that is very much at the forefront in the South African public sector at the moment. The example where the spaces in the public service where there is a lot of data input from the private sector is again the SARS on the side of customs, as well as on the side of personal income tax. And Home Affairs has the ABIS database that verifies your identity. There's the National Population Registry that sits in the back. ABIS built on top of that, Harness built on top of that. We are busy with the deployment, the implementation of ABIS, which is biometric information. And all of this eventually, in terms of our public policy, will hopefully lead us to the place where your national population register is completely digitalized and becomes the center point for both public and private confirmation of identity. Nozipo, you are right. The one area that worries me significantly is the fact that from a regulatory perspective, one is quite concerned about the fact that we just don't have the authorizing framework in place around data governance, data management, and cybersecurity. Our regulations are very, very thin in this area. In fact, the only place in the regulations where we talk about automated decision-making, for example, is in POPI. And so there's a complete overhaul that needs to happen with the future in mind around our regulations. It is a big, big area of concern. So the extent to which in practice you begin to find flows of data across public-private domains, I don't know. We are just not set up in that way as yet. Because even within government, people speak about interoperability, but it's really interfacing and drawing data. It's not yet systems sharing across with each other, which is interoperability. Internationally, we've seen that interoperability is increasingly being enabled by application programming interfaces, which is a more advanced way of doing so. And in South Africa, the standards that we have coming from the DPSA is still very much on the technical design side as opposed to using APIs and so on. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. We have a hand. Pfizer, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark, for helping us to reimagine not only how government work, but also open up a door on how citizens can participate in active citizenship through e-governance. So thank you. I have a question on responsibilities for posthumans. So what rights are attributed to post or non-human agents like AI and chatbots? So I want to find out the responsibilities of these agents if they have rights, because rights means responsibility. So for example, like AI, if an AI gives bad advice, what rights under public service, what rights or responsibility do we need to consider there?
Mark, you can go right ahead.
So you're taking us straight into the domain of ethics. This is a very, very underdeveloped area, not only in South Africa, but also internationally, where there isn't even yet agreement or general consensus on when these kinds of rights arise in automated decision-making, where the responsibilities lie. And what I suspect is going to happen, we're going to have precedent-setting cases because the regulations and the policies and the laws are much further behind. And we just don't have the luxury and the time where the cycle of regulation catches up, for example, with platforms in the private sector. It's taken us about 11 to 15 years to come to grips, at least from a competition perspective, on the way that power is exercised in these new technologies. And so we are very, very far behind with addressing those questions quite clearly.
Thank you. Colleagues, Thulani, go ahead.
If I may add, I think what Faiz just raised is partly what Hosanna raised as his last point regarding the system. If platforms are built for pro-poor or pro-rich, I think we didn't touch on that. But as someone who's involved, what I've seen is platform owners are sort of forced to make or design solutions that are sort of are balanced, but should mostly focus on the vulnerable or potential vulnerable users, and those would, in most cases, be pro-poor. Now, we see that through user license agreements and policies that would then be embedded on a particular platform or software. The question would be if how practical or how much application is done how much application is done to sort of enforce that, and I'm not too sure about that. But where things go or where things are is that you are required by law to sort of have a sentence or two, a paragraph, where you address the use of data, even from just gathering the data, and that's through cookies now. I think we would see most of the websites that we're accessing, they would say this website uses cookies. You can then either accept or reject. And then furthermore, it would then tell you that, or then there should be a statement or two that addresses the use of your data that you then willfully give, and what it would happen if, should you complain about your data, the rights that you have. I think that's as far as it goes. But in reality, if that data ever gets deleted, sanitized, that's another story. Thank you.
Thank you for that contribution, Thulani. Very, very practical, really, as I said, revealing, the key issues behind the scenes, but that really influence what happens on the main stage of public service digitalization. Colleagues, on that note, we have reached the end of our seminar for today, with many questions still open and in anticipation of further work from Mark's side. Many of our master's and PhD students are engaged in these kinds of research, in investigating more deeply what actually do we mean by digital transformation. And we will be having more such seminars, I think, particularly with respect to Mark's work. We will convene again, possibly towards the end of the year, somewhere around mid-November, and we hope that you will join us again at that point, when there will be data available to dig into. And we will also be making much of this content and the content of the work of our other postgrad students available on the LINK website. So greetings and thank you very much to everyone who made this, I think, a very special afternoon. Thank you, of course, first and foremost to Mark and his behind-the-scenes person, Shanti. Thank you to Chris Armstrong, the LINK Centre's behind-the-scenes person. Thank you to Hosanna, and thank you to our entire audience. Much appreciated, and bye-bye for now.